Let's be entirely honest. A loud faction of the internet wanted this movie to fail. They wanted to prove that a 20-year-old YouTuber had no business directing a massive studio film starring Oscar-nominated talent. They wanted to laugh when a masterclass in internet analog horror just turned into a generic, sanitized Hollywood jump scare fest. But A24's Backrooms isn't just a triumph, it's a beautifully agonizing, slow burn nightmare that completely humiliates the gatekeepers. It takes the abstract concept of liminal dread and anchors it so deeply into human trauma that it feels less like a modern creepypasta adaptation and more like Stanley Kubrick and David Lynch weaponized a Salvador Dali painting to systematically destroy your sanity. I went into the theater and there was a bunch of kids there, and I was completely expecting like high octane Minecraft and Five Nights at Freddy's chaos. And I was genuinely shocked that they're actually pretty quiet and well behaved. Maybe it's the film's oppressive atmosphere that literally paralyzed the room into silence, which honestly gives me a little hope for the younger generation. And this is a completely outsider view of this, an outsider's perspective. I heard about the Backrooms, and I never really even watched the original YouTube shorts or played any of the indie video games. So this is from a middle-aged film nerd perspective. So does it work as a piece of isolated high-level cinema? Spoiler alert, yes. And this does stick out. It subverts the traditional horror lighting like we just saw with Obsession. It's not trying to be scary of what's hiding in the dark. It's terrifying because everything is blasted in like a sickening fluorescent dead yellow color. It does kind of capture that Exit 8 style of liminal unease where the familiar becomes deeply, deeply wrong. But what's the movie actually about? He went missing in a massive extra-dimensional space. Cut to the real world where we meet Clark, played by the phenomenal Chiwetel Ejiofor, a struggling alcoholic furniture store owner drowning in a recent divorce and dwindling finances. He's seeing a therapist, Dr. Mary Klein, played by Renate Reinsve, who is carrying her own heavy psychological baggage from a schizophrenic mother and the demolition of her childhood home. When Clark investigates a bizarre electrical anomaly and a literal slit in the store's basement wall, he accidentally phases through reality and enters the Backrooms, an endless labyrinth of uncanny hallways and malformed furniture. Desperate to prove he hasn't completely lost his mind, Clark recruits his staff to help him film the space. But the deeper they venture into the yellow void, the more they realize they aren't just exploring an empty anomaly. The space is actively shifting, manifesting distorted approximations of their own worst memories, and something deeply unnatural is hunting them through the quiet. And we have to talk about the scale that 20-year-old Kane Parsons pulled off here. He went from building these digital spaces entirely in Blender on his home computer to A24 handing him the keys to build a massive 30,000 square foot practical labyrinth in Vancouver. Apparently, it is actual physical maze where the actors and crew members legitimately got lost between takes. And it does build that existential dread where you realize the map just never stops. And apparently they went through 50 different wallpapers to get the right one with this sickening fluorescent cooked shade to it. And it pays off because the color does feel like a physical migraine. Apparently, with everything, with the internet, there's always drama. There's a loud faction on Twitter and YouTube, cynical ones, that started this viral rumor where claiming that the 20-year-old kid couldn't possibly handle a studio set, alleging A24 secretly hired a ghost director to run the show. And before the release, Mark Duplass, he made a public statement saying he was intensely prepared and completely commanded the set. And that is probably more, generational jealousy. And damn, he does not feel like a first-time director. The cinematography in this feel incredibly deliberate and heavily inspired by Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick has always been a very demanding and very much a perfectionist. And I kind of hear that just from the 50 different wallpapers that they went through, trying to get the exact same one. They have these wide, dead center compositions that make the actors look tiny and swallowed up by the architecture. And in the middle, there is like a whole section of a found footage that really breaks up the monotony of the movie. It's a slow burn, and it's done so effectively. It's probably like my favorite part of the movie, despite or other than the ending chase scene. But coming back to how he directed the actual film of it outside of the found footage part. I mean, you can contrast that with like Hollywood horror. It's usually something in the shadows or jump scares. There's no shaky cams or cheap tricks to force adrenaline. It's elegant, cold, and distant, which make the supernatural elements feel horribly clinical and real. And this is a slow burn. It takes its time, and that's what you need with these liminal space horror films. With Clark, when he first discovers the Backrooms, it's him slowly exploring it. We're exploring it with him. And if you're expecting a Monster of the Week slasher, you're going to be frustrated, but this movie wears David Lynch on its sleeve. And I can see his inspirations through this film. And they're great inspirations. And like I said, it takes its sweet time, and I'm here for it. Letting Clark venture into the void, focusing on the like heavy, silent unease before introducing like the terrifyingly violent entities like the still life copies. It's an exercise in tension and not just cheap payoffs. And of course, Chiwetel Ejiofor, he's awesome in everything. Now, we have like a 20-year-old writing this, and he's writing someone as like Clark. He's kind of tragic, divorcee, alcoholic, and it's pretty straightforward. I mean, the 20-year-old doesn't have that much life experience, but it's not terrible. But I do think Ejiofor does elevate that character with his performance. And he's filling in the gaps maybe lacking from the life experience of the writer. You buy into his psychological collapse. Renate Reinsve is stellar as the co-lead. She transitions from a restrained, skeptical therapist into a woman fighting for her life in a twisted, copied reality. And we get a little Mark Duplass as Phil. He gets some lines towards the end. And for me, he felt kind of like a little jarringly out of place at the end. I don't know. That's just me, though. That's how and I watch a lot of his stuff, and I'm a fan of his, but it just seemed like he was a character from a different movie when he was talking. I don't know. That's how I felt. So let's lay out the autopsy of the ending. I want to do a little ending explained. If you just want to see my spoiler-free thoughts, check out my chapter below. But let's kind of like explore Backrooms a little bit, because it kind of reframes Clark's entire downward spiral. When Mary finally tracks Clark down into the depths of the labyrinth, he hasn't just lost his mind, he's been assimilated. He's living in a grotesque caricature of a dining room flanked by still life. The universe is broken, Control-C, Control-V copies of human beings. When we see Kat's severed head and demands Mary continue their therapy session via roleplay, he becomes sickeningly clear. Clark didn't get trapped here by accident. He chose this. The Backrooms didn't catch him, it welcomed him. For a divorced, alcoholic, failed architect drowning in debt under a flickering lights of his failing furniture store, this endless empty space became the ultimate form of toxic escapism. It is the physical manifestation of addiction. But the masterstroke of the climax happens when the space reacts to them. The Backrooms behaves like a sponge, absorbing the mental states of whoever is nearby. Because Clark's mind is a fractured, resentful wreck, the environment spawns a massive, deformed, humanoid copy of himself wearing a pirate costume, a twisted, literal manifestation of his own core regrets and childish failures. When the pirate Clark entity bites and kills him, Clark is literally destroyed by the worst, most monstrous version of his own ego. Mary's escape and subsequent capture by async scientists in hazmat suits seems like a rescue, but the final sequence pulls the rug out entirely. As Phil interrogates her, explaining that more doors are opening in the real world, Mary realizes the horrific truth. She never actually escaped. The Backrooms has already mapped her brain. The final montage showing rooms based on Mary's childhood memories, culminating in that copy of her in the interrogation room, proves that the labyrinth is expanding by digesting her psyche. Async thinks they are mapping the Backrooms, but the Backrooms is mapping them. So the first half of the movie is like subtle, deeply unnerving breadcrumbs that you completely miss if you're looking for cheap jump scares. The 3 colored breaker switches installed at an angle in Clark's distribution board, the inexplicably high electric bills, it's architectural foreshadowing. The Backrooms was already bleeding into the real world, like parasitically draining Clark's life and livelihood before he ever physically stepped through that drywall. When he reacts to Mary's skepticism with that raw defensive paranoia, you're not watching a sci-fi hero being doubted, you're watching an addict defending his stash. And let's kind of explore some of the themes, like junk space. The Backrooms is modeled after non-places, like these dead malls of the early 2000s and endless office buildings, airports, department stores, transient spaces meant to be passed through and not lived in. And Keynes pointed out that there is no better symbol for modern commercial monoculture than a drop ceiling. The film turns like a mundane corporate aesthetic into a nightmare. It kind of just forces us to look at junk space left behind by modern consumerism. Clark is a divorced alcoholic and a failed architect living inside his discount furniture store. The Backrooms literally opened beneath his feet and began feeding off his misery. He encounters a terrifying fleshier entity that represents his ex-wife, born out of his resentment and anger towards her. And the worst monsters are just our own bad memories and regrets. The Backrooms are not like a static environment. They behave like an artificial intelligence or like a sponge, expanding by absorbing and reflecting the mental states of whoever is near them. And we have to talk about like the obsession and addiction. I mean, Clark doesn't just stumble to the Backrooms once and try to escape. He becomes completely consumed by them. Clark is like sneaking into the Backrooms every night because he's hating his reality, his failed marriage, and his mounting debts. He stops drinking, and the labyrinth becomes a dark surrogate for his alcoholism, a place to hide from the real world. And his obsession bleeds outward, dragging his innocent employees and his therapist into the abyss with him. The Backrooms is the ultimate trap for an obsessive mind, an infinite puzzle with no inherent point, meeting, or exit, where the desire to solve it eventually drives you entirely insane. Very Lovecraftian. And you know, the Backrooms is kind of like cold bureaucracy versus a natural phenomenon. It isn't hell, it isn't purgatory, it just has no morality. Is it like a glitch in the universe? It kind of frames it as like a naturally occurring cosmic mistake with, you know, the furniture and shoes and everything kind of clipping into the reality. And it's sort of like the futility of science against this. So we got to talk about like Async, the Research Institute, looking into this. In that way, it kind of highlights the arrogance of human bureaucracy. Humanity looks at a terrifying, unknowable cosmic void and immediately tries to figure out how to zone it for real estate. So who is Backrooms actually for? Look, if you're heading into a theater looking for a standard popcorn munching studio slasher packed with cheap jump scares and a neat, heavily explained lore checklist, you're going to leave incredibly frustrated. This is a movie for patient horror fans. That is, for people who find a dead, silent, empty, fluorescent-lit hallway infinitely more terrifying than a monster jumping out from behind a door. If you appreciate atmospheric dread, meticulous cinematography, and horror that acts as a psychological Rorschach test for its characters, you're going to love this. It's a bold cinematic experiment that treats its audience and its internet origins with total respect. At the end of the day, what Kane Parsons has achieved here is nothing short of miraculous. To take a conceptual internet meme, transition from digital Blender files to massive physical studio set, and maintain this level of uncompromising, auteur-driven artistic vision is incredibly rare in the modern Hollywood machine. Themes don't always land perfectly, and a few late film narrative shifts feel a little clunky, but the sheer craft on display is undeniable. Parsons didn't just adapt a creepypasta, he proved that internet-born analog horror can be elevated into high-level Kubrician cinema. It's an unforgettable debut, and it makes me incredibly excited and deeply uneasy to see whatever nightmare he decides to build next. For anchoring abstract internet dread into a beautifully tragic, surrealist nightmare, A24's Backrooms earns a fantastic 4 out of 5. Check out my other videos by my head, and I'll see you next time.